Hi, let's talk about ethics. This is one of my favorite um, topics to talk about. It's also a very interesting discussion in person. So I am really sorry we can't have it there, but I'm hoping that we can take this, some of this into next week's tweet chat, and we'll start the conversation in the discussion board. So in the discussion board, I've posted a question or a couple of questions that I'd like you to think about. And I think that this, thinking about ethics in general is such an important exercise because in the heat of the moment, we don't tend to make very good decisions. So thinking through some of the dilemmas that we might face before we face them is smart and responsible. Okay, so let's chat about ethics. So I'm gonna open the slideshow. I've got all my notes and stuff up, so I'm gonna close some of that so we're not hide presenter notes. We're not looking at all of this extra stuff, and we'll get started. So I love this quote. Ethics is knowing the difference between what you have a right to do and what is right to do. Because some of these dilemmas are not illegal, but they are not right, and they're unethical. So let's just start. So the key to social media success when it comes to this discussion in particular, but really across the board, is trust. It's trusting that you are getting good information, that you're talking to real people, that you're the way that information is created and shared is transparent. You'll see that a couple of the topics that we've talked about so far sort of tie into this, particularly disinformation and misinformation is certainly that lacks transparency and lacks accountability, and so are certainly unethical in many cases. This idea of cancel or call out culture, which we've had some great conversations around, also fits into this discussion. And really it all comes down to trust. Can you trust the information and the people behind that information? I love this distinction, even though it's not directly an ethical, it's not phrased very in a very academic way, but you can think of it this way. What is the difference between being honest and being sleazy? Like, is there just a sense of sleazy behind something? Like when your gut says, this doesn't feel right. I don't feel good about this. It just feels sort of sleazy. Chances are there's an ethical component to that decision, is what I've found, right? If they're just like, there's just something that doesn't sit right, and you're not exactly sure what it is, it's often there's some ethical component that you're not thinking through. Or that you're not considering in your decision-making process. So there are a few key elements that are specific to social media and dilemmas that are specific to social media that are important to talk about. So the first one is around disclosure. And disclosure is the idea that, or the requirement in many cases, the requirement that you say who you are, and you say who's paying you, and you say you have there's an honesty and transparency in the information that you're providing and the way that you're providing it. And this idea of disclosure is really very central to so many social media dilemmas, our social media ethical dilemmas. And we'll talk about a couple of them today. And then I also will ask you to kind of think about that as you read and see information. Really think about, where's this information coming from? So there's certainly a media literacy component to this, but the ethical piece of it is in the disclosure or the lack thereof. One of my favorite gifts, we always have fun with this in class, but now a word from our sponsors, right? So you see that's clear. It's clear that there's a financial compensation. It's clear where the money is coming from. It's clear where the intent is coming from. And those pieces of the social media puzzle are extremely important, to the point of there being some legal bounds around disclosure. The other interesting dilemma is this idea of ghost blogging or ghost tweeting or ghost whatevering, um, which we don't actually, I don't think we talk about enough in terms of social media anymore. But the issue is that if you're ghosting for someone else, so you are speaking for someone else, writing for someone else, that you're not being honest when you're not disclosing the actual information. You're not being clear, and you're not disclosing everything you should disclose. Ghosting for someone else can be really a tricky dilemma, because on social media we do have an expectation that we're talking to who we think we're talking to. And certainly there's some brand, like you may be speaking to a brand, but you understand there's a person. I think that there's, again, I think there's less conversation about this that's happening right now, but it's not a lesser issue than it used to be, in the kind of early days of social media. So again, this is around disclosure. So saying who you are. I would talk about blogging for just a second around this, because corporate blogs are still, and even personal blogs are still a really vital communication channel. And I would strongly suggest that if you're planning a corporate blog or you're involved with a corporate blog, that you're clear about the authorship. And if a CEO, for example, is not a great writer, or doesn't want to write a blog, but wants a blog under his or her name, that you think of a way to do that makes sense and is transparent and ethical. I had a client a long time ago who was a fine writer, but he was busy and never really had time to do a good job with his writing. And so we decided, so first of all, the strategy included a corporate blog because he had some authority and some thought leadership that he wanted to share in the market, in the industry, but he didn't want to write it. So we landed on this kind of interview format where I would interview him, I would write the content, he would review the content, approve it, make sure that it sounded good to him. And then when we posted it on the company blog, it would say CEO name with Kelly Matthews. And that with, it was the indicator that he had a writing partner in that mix. And so that was our nod to disclosure, and really making sure that was an ethical process and a responsible process to the people who wanted to hear specifically from the CEO. I've had other situations. I had a friend who had an agency, and they had a client who wanted his agency to tweet as if they were the client during a conference, because the CEO was busy with the conference and would not have been able to do that. And the team landed again on kind of this hybrid approach where instead of just speaking from the CEO completely opaquely so that there was no indication that it wasn't the CEO, they changed the bio of the Twitter account to say, we're at such and such conference. I'm at such and such conference this week. My team is supporting the content. Any tweets authored by me will have my initials. Otherwise, it's, my team is providing support. And then occasional tweets to reinforce that, right? So these are not uncommon dilemmas that you'll face, even though we don't talk about this particular topic enough. So think about those as you think about your strategy going forward. The next dilemma, and this is definitely one that we have to think about. That's a common and current dilemma, and it also is ancient, like it's been around forever. So this idea of astroturfing. So AstroTurf, as you may be aware, is a brand name for the turf that's on sports fields. And of course, the turf on sports fields is designed to look like grass, right? So astroturfing is creating the appearance of a grassroots campaign, again, without the disclosure. So it looks as if it's a grassroots or down up or publicly supported kind of campaign, but in reality, maybe a very well-financed campaign, or the people involved may have a financial stake in other conflict of interest in the outcome of some activist effort. But the idea is really that it's kind of fake grassroots. So this is an old political term, as you might imagine. It fits quite nicely in politics, but it can apply to other things. And one of the things it applies to is this campaign with this young woman named Louise Delange. And Louise is a young French, millennial, I guess, young 20s. And she had this really popular Instagram account for a while, and had about 20 or 30 posts over the course of the 3 or 4 months. And at the end of the campaign, it was revealed in a post that she is not real. She's obviously a real person, but that's not her name, and she's not a travel, kind of a travel junkie, but that this was an anti-binge drinking campaign put on by an alcohol awareness organization in France. And so that was revealed in the final post of this campaign. So if you go back and look at the pictures, and I don't think this exists anymore. This has actually been around, this campaign's been around a little while. I love it. I love talking about this one. But if you were to go back and look, and even if you look at these photos, you can see she's got a drink in every photo, right? So the idea is that, the idea of the campaign is that you never know what alcoholism looks like, that it can have lots of different looks, and that it could be basically your friend, or it could be this glamorous Instagram star. So one of the interesting things about this campaign is I think you end up with this question of, does the means justify the end? Does the idea that Louise and this campaign was intended to be an education campaign justify the lack of transparency and the lack of disclosure, and quite frankly, the dishonesty? I think I have issues with this campaign because I think it feels dishonest. And I think that people don't like to feel tricked, and they don't like to feel stupid. And if they've been following along with her travels from a travel perspective, and then all of a sudden they feel stupid, that's not usually a good way to get them to tune into your campaign. But it's pretty clever, right? So she had a lot of traction. You can see she has hundreds of, if not thousands of likes on each post. The agency really did a lot of legit grassroots account building to get her account built up, which there was some fascinating discussion about that. And ultimately it was trying to do good. So isn't that good? I think I still land on the side of I don't like it. It makes me uncomfortable, and it feels unethical and irresponsible. I also worry that that last post that revealed the campaign, that people didn't see it, and so they never knew that it was a public service sort of campaign. I linked to a couple of articles about this on Canvas, so if you want to dig in a little bit and get some more of the background, it's a pretty fascinating campaign. Get some more of the background. I would encourage you to do so. And then the last kind of big bucket idea is this one of conflicting values. So I'm really trying to figure this one out because I think that there's some really interesting discussions that I don't quite have my arms around because I'm not an ethics scholar. So I'm trying to, think about how do we talk about this. But I think this conflicting values really is the reason that so many of the corporate communication issues in the last year, particularly those around social justice, have felt wrong. And I think as we've looked at I've looked specifically at organizations that have created self-inflicted wounds or issued terrible statements and then didn't back them up with action. So many examples. And as I look at those and have over the years, I'm like, well, that's just, it's inauthentic or it's irresponsible or it's tone deaf, like read the room. But I think the reason that we've all felt so uncomfortable with it is that there's this values conflict, that the organization's values, or at least their stated values, are out of sync or misaligned with our personal values as individuals and our collective societal values. And I think that's the piece that I think that's the explanation. Like, I think that's the reason that we're really that I've been trying to figure out, like, what is the core of why these bad decisions feel wrong? Like, they're not legally wrong. They're not, they feel subjectively wrong. And I know they're not subjectively wrong. So I'm trying to, I've been trying to figure that out and wrestle with it. Of course, we're going to talk about crisis communication next week, and these will come back and we'll talk about, how organizations have dealt with or not dealt with some of their self-inflicted wounds. So I'm going to ask you to think about this in the discussion the discussion board this week. So I pose a question. I also sent some information about a tweet that the LA Raiders made last week as the anchor point for this. So I would encourage you to look at that. Certainly encourage you to do it because it's part of your grade, but I think it's an interesting discussion. And we really have three frameworks to think about this with, right? So these three frameworks are virtue ethics, deontology, and consequentialism. And this is, again, I'm not an ethics scholar. So for those of you who may have taken or are ethics kind of interested from an academic perspective of ethics, I know I'm simplifying this. So bear with me, but I think this is a useful conversation and discussion to have. So virtue ethics really focuses on the inherent character of the person doing the action, right? So according to this system of thinking, this framework or this theory, we should possess as individuals, we have certain virtues like compassion or courage or generosity. And those virtues come out and manifest themselves in our actions. So if we are empathetic, if we are compassionate, if we are generous, if we have courage, then that comes through in our actions. And that our actions, if those virtues manifest in our actions, if we have them, if we are a virtuous person, and then the assumption is that our actions will be ethical regardless of how they might be viewed by others. So the theory basically says that good people do good things. And so I think this is tricky, right? Because I think we say things like, we use words like intent, and we use words like, well, that couldn't have been their intent. And so that gets a little tricky, right? Because we may be making some assumptions about an individual's personal ethics and personal virtues that maybe aren't fair, or maybe they don't deserve to have. I don't think this is quite, I think this is a way to think about it, right? That good people do good things. So it can't be unethical if if it's a good person's actions. Deontology is the opposite. So it puts the actions front and center. So the theories in this bucket say that certain types of actions are intrinsically good or bad and should or should not be performed regardless of the consequences, right? So it doesn't have anything to do with the person. It's all about the action. That certain actions are good, certain actions are bad, and it doesn't matter what's happening. You should or should not do those things based on whether they're good or bad. And then the third is consequentialism, and just self-definition focuses on the consequences of the action. So we should always act in a way that brings about the best results. The end justifies the means. This is that theory around end justifies the means. Utilitarianism is the most known of the consequentialist theories, and basically says that the action that benefits the most people is the right action. So do these make it easier? Do these theories make it easier to make an ethical decision, or to sort of parse out if someone else has made an ethical decision? Oh, probably not. In fact, it probably muddies it and makes it more complicated. But I think that having these frameworks and thinking about these frameworks can be really helpful in understanding that we are facing ethical dilemmas, and that we are facing an ethical dilemma, and that we need to think about how to respond to those dilemmas, or what decisions to make embedded in those dilemmas, based on a framework. And the theory is kind of the top end of that framework. So hold that thought, because we're going to come back to some of that. And then I think there's this whole bucket of issues, and this bucket of ethical issues and ethical dilemmas that's basically, it's kind of this subjectiveness that I just talked about. Like, it's maybe a conflict of values conflict, or it may just be in really poor taste that you're, which I think again sort of ladders up to that conflict in values. But I think there's this, I think that we have to ask, as communicators, we have to say, what's the worst that could happen? If we post this thing, what's the worst that could happen? If we share that news in that way, what's the worst that could happen? If we hire or fire that person, what's the worst that could happen? So here are some examples of that. Lockheed Martin, this has been a few years, looks like 3 years ago now, had a photo day celebration on August 19th. They said, do you have amazing photos of one of our products? Tag us in your pic, and we may feature it during our upcoming World Photo Day celebration. So what's the worst that could happen? If you're not aware, Lockheed Martin is an aerospace company, and they also make a fair amount of military equipment. Lockheed Martin makes and their military weaponry is used around the world. So if you ask the question, what's the worst that could happen? In this case, you might guess that the photos tagged were not beautiful sky horizon photos of airplanes taking off, but were photos of war and conflict and death and pain. That all of those images were photos that people shared and tagged with Lockheed Martin. Not a great decision, right? So certainly as a company, they have the license to operate. Like, we've given them collective permission as a society to operate and to serve, to provide these products. We may not as individuals, but as a society, we've said we need you to make weapons of war. And so we've given them permission to exist, but there's a misalignment there, right? So not asking what's the worst that could happen resulted in a pretty big flop of a campaign. But also, I mean, beyond just a flop in terms of not doing what they wanted it to do, it kind of did the opposite and really brought up a lot of maybe reputation or business practice issues that people may not have been aware of until this campaign. I know I don't think about defense contractors on a daily basis, but this campaign certainly raised that piece of their business to a higher profile in my mind. Okay, so Pornhub is sort of notorious for shock content. And so this you could take with a big giant Pornhub grain of salt, because they do this for shock value. But unfortunately, you see, I do think that there's an issue and probably some misalignment values misalignment, because the value of, the value around sexuality that is embedded in Pornhub as a business is not necessarily shouldn't necessarily misalign with the value of racial justice or equity or inclusion. And I know that seems weird for this particular business, but everybody, their sexuality is a thing, and there's Pornhub is a legal business, but it's certainly shock for the sake of shock isn't necessarily a great idea. And this is just obviously in very poor taste. So not something I would have recommended, even looking for shock value. This is always a fun conversation to have. So I wish we were doing this in person. I'll stop saying that now. But Delta shared this tweet and said, "Congrats, Team USA, nice goal." Tagged some people. USA versus Ghana is what that first tag is. US men's national team. Delta Seattle. I think Delta's the sponsor of the Seattle soccer team. And then posted these two images. So take a beat and think about, like, what about these images might be in poor taste? So the answer is that number one is an extraordinarily generic image of Africa. Africa is a large continent with 70 some odd different countries in it, and giraffes really only live in about 3. So they live on the opposite side of the continent. And so there was a fair amount of pushback to Delta with this image and on this tweet, because they couldn't just do their basic due diligence and come up with an image that actually worked for that actually would work for Ghana. There are no giraffes in West Africa. And so take a minute, find a better image. Obviously the USA piece is still both of these are super generic, which is sort of lame to begin with, like stock photo lame, but at least that's an iconic image of a country, the country of the USA, not trying to have an iconic image of a continent with lots of different countries in within its borders. So again, kind of in poor taste, also a little bit of a misalignment, right? Like, just take a second and don't be so friggin' US centric and come up with an image that actually says that you have a sense of the world. Ghana has some beautiful imagery that you could include and would still say Africa for people that may not have a lot of knowledge about Ghana, but would be more culturally appropriate to Ghanaian culture. Okay. Another one, DiGiorno Pizza. Several years ago, again, you can see the tag, but these same issues come up over and over and over, but this was one worth talking about. So there was a hashtag that came up, why I stayed, hashtag why I stayed. And DiGiorno chimed in with, why I stayed, you had pizza. And the problem with this, again, not asking like basic due diligence questions. The problem was the hashtag why I stayed was exclusively around the topic of domestic violence. And so DiGiorno chiming in with why I stayed, you had pizza, indicated that they had absolutely no sense of what the conversation was about and looked completely tone deaf and dismissive of the women that were sharing their stories, dismissive of a very difficult piece of the puzzle for women who are in domestic violence situations. So again, in very poor taste, but also was the ethics that they weren't paying attention and weren't thinking about the impact of their actions on their customers. There's also this whole movement or whole trend. I don't even know if it's not intentional, but a common issue around when celebrities in particular pass away, brands chiming in with some sort of bizarre tribute. So Cinnabon said, RIP Carrie Fisher, you will always have the best buns in the galaxy. I don't know. I mean, tacky at best. I think that it's, yeah, I think it's just tacky. I think that often in cases where there's sort of national conversation going on around a death or a tragedy or an event of some kind where everybody's talking, I think there's a good rule of thumb to think about that people mourn. As individuals, we mourn our idols, we mourn our loved ones, we mourn people who we've enjoyed watching as actors, or artists. We mourn people who are, you know, involved with any kind of tragedy. We mourn. Media help us to sort of interpret that, to help give us context and give us information and create a sense, you know, give us the tributes and provide the backstory and remind us of that song that we loved or that performance that, you know, that original performance where we really became Carrie Fisher fans. Like, that's what the media helps us with that. The third piece are brands, and often brands just need to shut up. They don't need to be part of the conversation. Nobody is asking Cinnabon to come out with a clever tweet mourning Carrie Fisher. Like, that's just, it's just not appropriate. It feels really tone deaf, and it ultimately, I would say, feels disrespectful, kind of minimizes her as her work, in this tweet in particular, kind of minimizes her work, and creates sort of a bizarre double entendre around best buns that doesn't feel like something you should be saying at all. So there are some specific problems with this, but I think in general, you know, we as people are mourning, but brands don't have a voice in that. They're not people. Brands aren't people. So we don't need to hear their perspective. This one also tacky. I can't imagine in a million years that David Bowie would have worn Crocs. So why would Crocs be chiming in on this? And I'm sure that the social media manager or the marketing manager was a huge David Bowie fan. They're people. The people are mourning, and so a huge David Bowie fan, like, we should say something. Isn't this clever? Oh my gosh. So the people are mourning, but they're expressing that through their brand, which is the piece that feels in poor taste. Prince is another one. I think that this one is always an interesting discussion for a couple of reasons. These have different tie-ins, right? So I'm going to talk about them. So the bottom is Four Loko, and they're going to pour one out for Prince, which seems just ridiculously tacky. No, thank you. So I think we can all agree that that one's crappy. And then we have Cheerios and 3M, and those seem weird to me. Just turning your logo purple seems weird, and seems, again, in that same vein as being inappropriate, and really is the expression of individuals mourning through a brand page. So both Cheerios and 3M are based in the Midwest, based in Minnesota. Prince is also based in Minnesota. So even though they're both global companies, they have a local presence, right? So they are a big employer, they have a local presence. And so one could argue that because they have some local connection, that it might be less distasteful. I don't totally buy it. I think that most people don't even realize where those companies are based, and so they don't make that connection. So I think that I think this was a misstep on both of their parts, that there was maybe another way to honor to honor Prince more locally or with employees, for example. The one that always trips me up with this, what sounds like a hard and fast rule, is the Chevrolet one. And you can see, baby, that was much too fast, 58 to 2016, and it's a red Corvette. So I will say, in full disclosure, I am a ginormous Prince fan. And saw him in concert at Memorial Coliseum years and years ago, and just a ginormous fan. So love, 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 love Prince. And this one always trips me up because it does have a very specific tie-in to his music that is known and recognizable. Even though Chevrolet doesn't have a specific connection to Prince, it's still a brand. It still feels, to me, slightly, I think it feels more authentic to the brand, and not in a distasteful way, and you know, recognizing that connection that the brand had to this artist that was just through his lyrics. So there are some exceptions, and I could even be, you know, we could even argue about 3M and Cheerios for, you know, the afternoon. But ultimately you have to ask, what's the worst that could happen? What are we missing? What are we not thinking about? Okay, so I'm gonna stop there, and then I will have a second video with some more information, but I think that gives you plenty of fodder for your discussion board this week, and lots to think about. So I look forward to hearing what you think, and look forward to seeing your conversations online.